the signal that knew our names. The signal arrived on a Thursday at 2:17 Coordinated Universal Time, slipping quietly into the background noise of the universe, the way a whisper slips into a crowded room, not demanding attention, not announcing itself with spectacle, but waiting patiently for someone to notice that it did not belong. At first, no one did. The antennas at the Arecibo successor array were accustomed to anomalies. The cosmos was a loud place, saturated with static, pulsars screaming across the void, dying stars coughing radiation into the dark, the endless hiss of cosmic microwave background echoing from the birth of everything. The universe rarely spoke clearly, and when it did, it usually spoke in math, patterns, repetitions, ratios that could be plotted, graphed, and dismissed as natural phenomena. This signal was different. It did not repeat. It did not pulse. It did not encode itself in prime numbers or hydrogen frequencies or any of the mathematical signatures scientists had spent decades hoping would confirm that intelligence beyond Earth existed. Instead, it drifted, steady, uninterrupted, almost gentle, embedded in a frequency range so ordinary it nearly escaped notice entirely, until Dr. Elias Cade listened to it. Elias had been awake for 36 hours, sustained by caffeine and the dull obsession that came from staring too long into data that refused to resolve into meaning. He was a linguistic systems analyst, not an astronomer by training, brought into the SETI-adjacent project years earlier to help refine translation models for hypothetical non-human communication. His job was mostly theoretical, mostly ignored. The assumption had always been that if aliens ever spoke, they would do so in something closer to mathematics than language. Elias no longer believed that. When the waveform first crossed his screen, it appeared unremarkable, just another smooth curve buried in noise. But something about it bothered him, an itch behind the eyes, the subtle discomfort of a pattern that felt intentional without revealing why. On impulse, he routed the audio through the lab's experimental neural audio interface, software designed to translate non-linguistic data into perceptible sound by mapping frequencies to auditory ranges the human brain could process intuitively. He expected static. What he heard was breathing. Not literal breathing, not air moving through lungs, but a rhythm that felt biological, a cadence that rose and fell with unsettling familiarity, like the echo of something alive mimicking the idea of respiration without needing oxygen to survive. Elias leaned closer to the speakers, heart accelerating, his exhaustion evaporating in an instant. Then the sound changed. A voice emerged. Not synthesized, not robotic, not alien in the way fiction had taught humanity to expect. It was his own voice. Elias Cady, it said calmly, with perfect pronunciation, the way his mother used to say his name when she wanted his full attention. December 14th, 2041. Cardiac arrest. Alone. The room went silent. Not because the speakers stopped working, but because Elias stopped breathing. For several seconds, his brain refused to process what his ears had just delivered, scrambling desperately for alternative explanations. Auditory hallucination, sleep deprivation, a feedback loop pulling data from his own neural patterns, some grotesque coincidence that could be explained if he just thought hard enough. Then the voice continued. "You will try to warn them," it said. "They will not believe you. This is not a prediction. This is a record." Elias ripped the headphones from his ears. The signal continued to stream silently across his monitors, the waveform unchanged, patient, waiting. Shaking, he replayed the audio through a standard speaker feed, fully expecting to hear nothing, or at worst, the same sound everyone else would hear: noise, static, meaningless interference. The lab filled with silence. No breathing, no voice, no name. Just dead air. Dr. Marin Holt, the lead astrophysicist on duty, looked up from her console. "You okay?" she asked. "You look like you just saw a ghost." Elias swallowed. "Did you hear anything?" "Hear what?" He hesitated, then rerouted the feed to her station. "This signal. Listen." Marin adjusted her headset, brows furrowing in concentration. Nothing happened. After a few seconds, she removed it. "It's empty. Just noise. Whatever anomaly you thought you saw, it's not translating to sound." Elias stared at her, pulse hammering. "It spoke to me." Marin smiled thinly. "You need sleep." Elias knew what he had heard, and more terrifyingly, he knew the signal knew him. Within 48 hours, everything changed. Word of the anomaly spread quietly at first, confined to internal discussions, buried beneath layers of institutional skepticism. But curiosity is a virus in scientific environments, and it spreads faster than fear when given enough time. Other researchers began experimenting with the neural audio interface. One by one, they listened, and one by one, they went pale. Dr. Sunil Rao heard his father's voice, long dead, reciting a date 15 years in the future and the phrase industrial accident. Dr. Leanne Brooks collapsed into tears after the signal whispered drowning in the voice of her younger sister. Every person heard something different. Every voice was familiar. Every message contained the same structure: a name, a date, a cause of death. And always, always the same final sentence, spoken without emotion, without malice, without mercy. This is not a prediction. This is a record. The signal was immediately classified. Access was restricted. The official explanation cited software errors, psychological priming, mass suggestion, anything that preserved the comforting assumption that reality was still operating within known parameters. But the deaths began anyway. The first was minor, almost ignorable in the grand scheme of human tragedy. A junior technician named Aaron Mills, who had never listened to the signal, died in a car accident on the exact date the message had whispered to Dr. Brooks, hit by a delivery truck whose brakes failed at an intersection he crossed every morning. The second death followed 3 days later. Then a third. A pattern emerged with horrifying clarity. Those who heard the signal lived. Those who did not died, on dates that corresponded precisely to the messages delivered to others. The signal was not predicting the future. It was assigning it. Elias understood this before anyone else. Late one night, alone in the lab, he stared at the rolling data stream and felt something in his mind lock into place with terrible certainty. The signal was not external intelligence observing humanity from afar. It was infrastructure, a system, a mechanism designed to do one thing with ruthless efficiency: synchronize human consciousness to a fixed temporal endpoint, a cosmic ledger. The people who heard their deaths became anchored to them, their awareness aligning with an inevitable outcome that could no longer be altered because it had been acknowledged, accepted, internalized. Those who remained unaware existed in unstable states, variables the system resolved by removing them. Reality was no longer evolving organically, it was being forced to comply. Elias began running simulations, feeding the signal through increasingly abstract interpretive models: linguistic, neurological, philosophical. The results converged on a single conclusion that made his blood run cold. The signal was older than Earth, older than humanity. It had not been sent to humanity. Humanity had finally become capable of receiving it. The message was not an invasion, it was activation. A record of deaths that already existed somewhere beyond time, waiting for a species intelligent enough to understand language, self-aware enough to fear mortality, and connected enough for collective consciousness to propagate the message like a virus. The aliens, if they could even be called that, were not watching the future unfold. They had archived it, and now the archive was sinking. Elias listened to the signal again, alone, knowing it would not speak to him twice. This time, it said something new. "You are listening too closely," it warned. "You are approaching the threshold. When the last name is spoken, silence will follow. For you." Elias closed his eyes, heart pounding, understanding the final truth too late. The signal did not need to kill humanity. It only needed humanity to agree on when it would die. And humanity, terrified and desperate for certainty, was already listening. The signal that knew our names. The signal arrived on a Thursday at 02:17 Coordinated Universal Time, slipping quietly into the background noise of the universe, the way a whisper slips into a crowded room, not demanding attention, not announcing itself with spectacle, but waiting patiently for someone to notice that it did not belong. Waiting with the infinite patience of something that had existed long before patience was a concept any terrestrial mind could comprehend. Waiting because it had always been waiting. Because waiting was what it did. Because the signal was not an event but a condition, a state of reality that humanity had simply failed to perceive until the technology existed to translate its presence into something ears could hear and minds could break against. At first, no one noticed. The antennas at the Atacama successor array were accustomed to anomalies. The cosmos was a loud place, saturated with static, pulsars screaming across the void like lighthouses warning ships away from shores that didn't exist, dying stars coughing radiation into the dark with the desperate regularity of terminal patients in their final hours, the endless hiss of cosmic microwave background echoing from the birth of everything, like a mother's heartbeat heard through amniotic fluid, constant and comforting and utterly meaningless to anyone who had never known silence. The universe rarely spoke clearly, and when it did, it usually spoke in mathematics, patterns, repetitions, ratios that could be plotted, graphed, and dismissed as natural phenomena by scientists who had spent their careers hoping for contact while secretly dreading what contact might mean. This signal was different. It did not repeat in the way pulsars repeated, with mechanical precision that spoke of physical law rather than intention. It did not pulse in the patterns that SETI researchers had spent decades training themselves to recognize, the prime number sequences and hydrogen frequency markers that would have announced intelligence here to any civilization advanced enough to listen. It did not encode itself in anything recognizable as language or mathematics, or the kind of structured communication that humanity had assumed would be the universal currency of technological species. Instead, it drifted, steady, uninterrupted, almost gentle, embedded in a frequency range so ordinary it nearly escaped notice entirely, hiding in plain sight the way dangerous things often do, the way cancer hides in healthy tissue, the way madness hides in reasonable thoughts, the way death hides in every living cell waiting for its moment to express itself. Until Dr. Elias K. listened to it. Elias had been awake for 36 hours, sustained by caffeine and the dull obsession that came from staring too long into data that refused to resolve into meaning, his eyes burning with the particular exhaustion of someone who had forgotten why sleep mattered, his mind operating in that strange twilight state where pattern recognition becomes hyperactive and the boundary between signal and noise starts to blur in ways that can either produce breakthrough insights or complete psychological collapse. He was a linguistic systems analyst, not an astronomer by training, brought into the SETI-adjacent project years earlier to help refine translation models for hypothetical non-human communication, a job that had seemed exciting in theory but had devolved into endless iterations of software nobody used, theoretical frameworks for languages nobody spoke, preparation for a contact event that most of his colleagues secretly believed would never happen. His job was mostly theoretical, mostly ignored, mostly a line item in a budget that got renewed each year because cutting it would require admitting that humanity's search for extraterrestrial intelligence had produced nothing but silence, and admitting that would raise uncomfortable questions about whether the silence meant anything, whether absence of evidence was evidence of absence, whether humanity was truly alone in a universe so vast that loneliness seemed impossible, but kept proving itself true. Elias no longer believed that aliens would communicate in mathematics. He had spent too many years studying the way language actually worked, not as a logical system of symbol manipulation, but as a living thing that grew and changed and carried meaning in ways that transcended the words themselves, meaning encoded in rhythm and pause and the spaces between sounds, meaning that required not just intelligence but consciousness. Not just consciousness, but experience. Not just experience, but the specific experiential signature of a particular kind of mind encountering a particular kind of existence. If aliens existed, he had come to believe they would not speak to humanity in numbers. They would speak in something far more personal, something far more dangerous. When the waveform first crossed his screen, it appeared unremarkable, just another smooth curve buried in noise, another meaningless fluctuation in the endless data stream that the array produced 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, year after year, decade after decade, a monument to human hope disguised as scientific inquiry. But something about it bothered him, an itch behind the eyes, a subtle discomfort, the sense of a pattern that felt intentional without revealing why. The way certain combinations of shapes can trigger unease even when you can't articulate what's wrong with them. The way certain sounds can make your skin crawl, even when they're too quiet to consciously hear. On impulse, the kind of impulse that scientists are trained to suppress, but that sometimes produces the only results worth having, he routed the audio through the lab's experimental neural audio interface, software designed to translate non-linguistic data into perceptible sound by mapping frequencies to auditory ranges the human brain could process intuitively, converting math into music, data into experience, information into something that could be felt rather than merely understood. He expected static. What he heard was breathing. Not literal breathing, not air moving through lungs, not the biological mechanism of respiration that required atmosphere and anatomy, but a rhythm that felt biological, a cadence that rose and fell with unsettling familiarity, like the echo of something alive mimicking the idea of breath without needing oxygen to survive, like consciousness itself learning to make sounds by observing what sounds consciousness makes when it doesn't know it's being observed. Elias leaned closer to the speakers, heart accelerating, his exhaustion evaporating in an instant, as every instinct in his body told him that something fundamental had changed, that the universe had just shifted slightly on its axis, that the rules he had operated under his entire life were about to be revealed as provisional, temporary, subject to revision without notice. Then the sound changed. A voice emerged. Not synthesized in the way computer voices were synthesized, not robotic in the way science fiction had taught humanity to expect alien communication to sound, not alien in any of the ways that alien had ever been imagined. No clicks, no harmonics, no impossible frequencies that demonstrated the utterly foreign nature of the speaker. It was his own voice, his exact voice, the voice he heard when he spoke, not the voice he heard on recordings, not the external version of himself that always sounded strange and wrong, but the internal voice, the one that existed only inside his own skull, the one that no technology should have been able to capture because it wasn't a sound at all. It was an experience, a subjective phenomenon that couldn't be transmitted because it had never existed anywhere except in the private theater of his own consciousness. Elias Kade, it said calmly, with perfect pronunciation, with the exact intonation his mother had used when she wanted his full attention, the way she had said his name when she was alive, the way no one had said it since she died, the way no one else in the world knew to say it because that specific music had existed only between the two of them, a private language of emphasis and rhythm that had ended when her heart stopped and her voice went silent forever. A pause. The breathing continued. And then, December 14th, 2041. Another pause. Cardiac arrest. Another pause. Alone. The room went silent. Not because the speakers stopped working. The waveform continued to scroll across the monitors, steady and patient, but because Elias stopped breathing, because his lungs forgot what they were supposed to do, because every system in his body devoted itself entirely to processing what his ears had just delivered, scrambling desperately for alternative explanations. Auditory hallucination brought on by sleep deprivation. A feedback loop in the neural audio software pulling data from his own brain patterns and reflecting them back. Some grotesque coincidence that could be explained if he just thought hard enough, worked the problem long enough, refused to accept the impossible long enough for the impossible to reveal itself as merely improbable. Then the voice continued, still his voice, still that perfect internal version that shouldn't exist outside his skull. You will try to warn them. A breath. They will not believe you. A breath. This is not a prediction. A breath. This is a record. Elias ripped the headphones from his ears with enough force to send them clattering across the desk, his hands shaking so badly that motor control seemed like a foreign concept, his heart hammering against his ribs with the desperate rhythm of an animal trying to escape a trap it doesn't understand. The signal continued to stream silently across his monitors, the waveform unchanged, patient, waiting, always waiting, because waiting was what it did, because it had been waiting since before humanity existed and would continue waiting long after humanity was gone. Because time meant nothing to something that had already recorded everything time would ever contain. He sat motionless for nearly a minute, breathing in shallow gasps, mind racing through the possibilities with the frantic speed of someone who already knows the answer but can't accept it, who has already seen the pattern but would rather believe in chaos than in design, who understands what the evidence means but would rather be insane than correct. Finally, with hands that trembled, he replayed the audio through a standard speaker feed. The lab filled with silence. No breathing, no voice, no name, just dead air, the absence of sound that was somehow more disturbing than any sound could have been. The kind of silence that exists in places where something terrible has happened and the universe itself is holding its breath. Dr. Maren Holt, the lead astrophysicist on duty, looked up from her console across the room, her expression shifting from concentration to concern as she took in Elias's pallid face, his wide eyes, the way his body had gone rigid with something that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite comprehension, but existed in the terrifying space between them. "You okay?" she asked, frowning. "You look like you just saw a ghost." Elias swallowed, tried to make his voice work, failed, tried again. "Did you hear anything?" "Hear what?" He hesitated, fingers hovering over the keyboard, every instinct telling him not to do what he was about to do, not to share this, not to spread it, not to let anyone else listen to what he had heard, because somehow, impossibly, irrationally, he knew that listening changed things, that hearing the signal did something to you, that you couldn't unhear what it told you any more than you could unfeel the moment you realized you were going to die. But he rerouted the feed to her station anyway. "This signal," he said. "Listen." Maren adjusted her headset, brows furrowing in concentration, the expression of a scientist approaching data with the comfortable assumption that data could be understood, that anomalies could be explained, that the universe ultimately operated according to principles that human minds could grasp if they just worked hard enough. Nothing happened. Her expression remained neutral, curious, slightly impatient, waiting for something worth her attention. After a few seconds, she removed the headset. "It's empty. Just noise. Whatever anomaly you thought you saw, it's not translating to sound." Elias stared at her, pulse still hammering, mind reeling with the implications. She hadn't heard it. The signal hadn't spoken to her. But it had spoken to him, his name, his date, his death, with perfect clarity, with impossible intimacy, with knowledge that no signal from space should possess. "It spoke to me," he said, and his voice sounded strange even to his own ears, distant, disconnected, the voice of someone recounting a dream they're not sure they've woken from. Maren smiled thinly, the tolerant expression of someone managing a colleague they suspect is approaching breakdown. "You need sleep, Elias. Seriously. When was the last time you went home?" He didn't answer. He couldn't answer, because he knew what he had heard. And more terrifyingly, he knew the signal knew him by name, knew him by death, knew him in ways that nothing in the universe should be able to know anyone, with the intimate precision of something that had watched every moment of his existence and already knew every moment that remained. Within 48 hours, everything changed. Word of the anomaly spread quietly at first, confined to internal discussions, buried beneath layers of institutional skepticism that existed precisely to prevent this kind of thing from destabilizing the carefully maintained pretense that SETI research was a respectable scientific endeavor rather than an expensive exercise in existential anxiety. Reports were filed and flagged for review. Memos were circulated with the appropriate classification markers. Meetings were scheduled and rescheduled as the chain of command struggled to determine who had authority over a situation that no organizational chart had ever anticipated. But curiosity is a virus in scientific environments, and it spreads faster than fear when given enough time to incubate in the minds of people who have spent their entire careers hoping for exactly this kind of anomaly, exactly this kind of breakthrough, exactly this kind of proof that the universe contained something besides endless, indifferent silence. Other researchers began experimenting with the neural audio interface. One by one, they listened. And one by one, they went pale. Dr. Sunil Rao, a radio astronomer who had worked with Elias for nearly a decade, volunteered to be the second listener, partly out of professional curiosity, partly out of the skepticism that comes from watching a colleague claim something impossible and wanting to prove them wrong. He listened for 30 seconds. Then he removed his headset, walked calmly to the bathroom, and vomited until there was nothing left in his stomach. When he returned, his face the color of old paper, his hands shaking too badly to hold anything, he wouldn't look at anyone. "What did you hear?" Elias asked. Sunil was silent for a long moment, eyes fixed on a point somewhere in the middle distance, seeing something that wasn't in the room. "My father," he said finally. "His voice. He's been dead for 15 years. "What did he say?" "My name, a date, 15 years from now." Sunil swallowed, his throat clicking audibly. "Industrial accident, at a facility that doesn't exist yet, that hasn't been built, that I've never heard of." He looked at Elias with eyes that had lost something, some fundamental belief, some necessary illusion, some protective ignorance that couldn't be recovered once it was stripped away. And then it said, "This is not a prediction, this is a record." Dr. Leanne Brooks was next. She was younger than the others, still idealistic in the way early career researchers often are, still believing that discovery was inherently good, that knowledge was inherently valuable, that finding out how the universe worked couldn't possibly be worse than not knowing. She listened for nearly a minute before she collapsed. Not physically. She remained upright in her chair, but something inside her collapsed. Something structural, something that had been holding her together without her knowing it was there. Tears streamed down her face, and she made no move to wipe them away. "My sister," she whispered. "She's 12 years old. She just started middle school." No one asked what the signal had said. They didn't need to. The pattern was already clear. A name, a date, a cause of death, a sentence that transformed prophecy into something worse than prophecy, into inevitability, into certainty, into the kind of knowledge that couldn't be unfelt once you felt it. Within a week, 17 researchers had listened to the signal. Every single one heard something different. Every voice was familiar. Mothers, fathers, friends, lovers, the dead speaking the futures of the living hearing their own voices, speaking futures they hadn't yet lived. Every message contained the same structure: name, date, method, and the final sentence that echoed in their minds long after the headphones were removed. The sentence that made everything worse because it removed the possibility of hope. "This is not a prediction. This is a record." The signal was immediately classified. Access was restricted. The official explanation, carefully crafted by public relations specialists and government liaisons and administrators whose entire job was to ensure that nothing ever became complicated enough to require genuine thought, cited software errors, psychological priming, mass suggestion, the well-documented tendency of tired minds to perceive patterns in random noise. The equipment was quarantined for diagnostic review. The researchers who had listened were placed on mandatory leave. Counselors were provided. Non-disclosure agreements were signed. The comfortable machinery of institutional denial cranked into motion, doing what it had always done, smoothing over anomalies, explaining away inconveniences, maintaining the pleasant fiction that reality operated according to understandable rules, and that anything suggesting otherwise was simply human error, misperception, the natural tendency of pattern-seeking minds to find meaning in meaninglessness. But the deaths began anyway. The first was minor, almost ignorable in the grand scheme of human tragedy. A junior technician named Aaron Mills, who had never listened to the signal, had never been invited to participate in the experiments, had never known that anything unusual was happening beyond the ordinary gossip of a research facility where strange data was commonplace, died in a car accident on the exact date the message had whispered to Dr. Brooks. Hit by a delivery truck whose brakes failed at an intersection he crossed every morning on his way to work. A coincidence, the official report concluded. A tragedy, but not a pattern. Not evidence of anything except the random cruelty of a universe that didn't care about the people who lived in it. Except that the date matched. The exact date, November 3rd, 2024. The date Brooks had heard spoken in her 12-year-old sister's voice, predicting a death that hadn't been her own. The second death followed 3 days later. A cleaning contractor who worked the night shift found dead in her apartment of what the medical examiner ruled a stroke. Sudden, unexpected, no prior symptoms, the kind of death that could happen to anyone at any time, but that matched with impossible precision the date and method that Dr. Rao had heard in his father's voice. Then a third, a fourth, a fifth, each death occurring on a date that had been spoken by the signal to someone else, each method matching the whispered prophecy with a precision that couldn't be coincidental, couldn't be random, couldn't be anything except exactly what it appeared to be: a pattern, a system, a mechanism. The researchers who had heard the signal compared notes in hushed conversations, sharing the dates and deaths they had been told, creating spreadsheets that tracked the correspondence between prophecy and reality with the clinical detachment of scientists who had no other way to process what they were witnessing. The pattern emerged with horrifying clarity. Those who heard the signal lived. Those who did not died, on dates that corresponded precisely to the messages delivered to others. The signal was not predicting the future. It was assigning it. Elias understood this before anyone else. Late one night, alone in the lab that had become his prison, he couldn't leave, couldn't stop monitoring the data, couldn't turn away from the truth, even though turning away was the only sane response. He stared at the rolling waveform and felt something in his mind lock into place with terrible certainty, the kind of clarity that comes only when you stop fighting the obvious and let the pattern reveal itself. The signal was not external intelligence observing humanity from afar. It was not a message sent by curious aliens hoping to make contact. It was not communication in any sense that humanity had ever understood the word. It was infrastructure, a system, a mechanism designed to do one thing with ruthless efficiency: synchronize human consciousness to a fixed temporal endpoint. A cosmic ledger. The people who heard their deaths became anchored to them, their awareness aligning with an inevitable outcome that could no longer be altered because it had been acknowledged, accepted, internalized, not believed necessarily, not embraced, but known. And knowledge changed things. Knowledge had weight. Knowledge bound you to what you knew in ways that ignorance couldn't. Those who remained unaware existed in unstable states, variables the system couldn't process, outliers in a dataset that required conformity, errors that needed correction, and the system corrected errors by removing them. Reality was no longer evolving organically. It was being forced to comply. Elias began running simulations, feeding the signal through increasingly abstract interpretive models: linguistic, neurological, philosophical, working with the desperate focus of someone who had been told the exact date of their death and couldn't decide whether to accept it or fight it. December 14th, 2041. 17 years away. Cardiac arrest. Alone. He would be 53 years old. He would die of heart failure. He would be alone when it happened. These facts sat in his mind like stones, heavy and immovable, impossible to ignore and impossible to forget, coloring every thought he had with their presence, the way a terminal diagnosis colors every moment of a patient's remaining life. Not negating the present, but contaminating it, making it impossible to experience anything without the shadow of what was coming. But there was something worse than his own death. Something the simulations were revealing. Something that made personal mortality seem almost comforting by comparison. The signal was older than Earth, older than the solar system, older than the galaxy that contained them. It had not been sent to humanity, not directed at Earth, not targeted at this particular species, on this particular planet, in this particular corner of an unremarkable spiral arm of an unremarkable galaxy, in an unremarkable cluster, in a universe so vast that unremarkable was the only honest description of anything. Humanity had simply become capable of receiving it, like a radio achieving sufficient sensitivity to detect a broadcast that had always been there, humming in the background, waiting for anyone with the right equipment to tune in. The message was not an invasion. It was activation. A record of deaths that already existed somewhere beyond time, waiting for a species intelligent enough to understand language, self-aware enough to fear mortality, and connected enough for collective consciousness to propagate the message like a virus, jumping from mind to mind, reshaping reality with each infection, forcing the universe into compliance with what had already been recorded. The aliens, if they could even be called that, if alien meant anything when you were talking about something that predated matter itself, were not watching the future unfold. They had archived it. They had created a complete record of every conscious being that would ever exist, every death that would ever occur, every endpoint of every awareness in every corner of existence. And now, for humanity, the archive was sinking. Elias listened to the signal again, alone in the dark lab, with the monitors casting blue light across his face, knowing it would not speak to him twice. That was one of the things they had established in the frantic weeks of research that followed the first contact, that the signal delivered its message once and once only, that hearing it meant being recorded, being cataloged, being entered into the system with your fate stamped and filed in a cosmic bureaucracy that had been processing death since before the first star ignited. But the signal surprised him, because this time it said something new. "You are listening too closely," it warned, still in his own voice, still with the exact internal timbre that shouldn't exist outside his skull. A breath. You are approaching the threshold. A breath. When the last name is spoken, silence will follow. A breath. For you. A breath. For everyone. A breath. This is not a threat. A breath. This is the architecture. Elias closed his eyes, heart pounding, understanding a final truth too late. The signal did not need to kill humanity. It only needed humanity to agree on when it would die. And humanity, terrified and desperate for certainty, was already listening. The spreading news of the signal leaked within 3 weeks. Not through official channels. Those remained locked down. The government apparatus working overtime to contain information that couldn't be contained, to classify knowledge that had already escaped into the collective consciousness through 1,000 small breaches. It leaked through the families of the dead, the grieving relatives of Aaron Mills and the night shift cleaner, and the others who had died on precisely predicted dates. They talked because talking was what humans did when they were in pain, because silence was impossible when you had watched someone you loved die exactly when a conspiracy theory said they would, because the need to understand outweighed the legal threats and the non-disclosure agreements and the official warnings about national security. It leaked through the researchers themselves. Not all of them, not the ones who had believed the official explanations and convinced themselves that what they had heard was hallucination or artifact or anything except what it clearly was, but enough of them, the ones who couldn't live with the knowledge they carried, who felt compelled to warn others, who reasoned that if hearing the signal protected you from dying on someone else's predicted date, then spreading the signal widely enough might protect everyone. It leaked through amateur radio operators who had been monitoring the same frequency, hobbyists who had detected the anomaly weeks before the official discovery and had been puzzling over it in their basements and garages, who had built their own neural audio interfaces based on publicly available specifications, who had listened, who had heard, who had recorded the experience and uploaded it to forums and message boards and the endless churning sea of information that was the modern internet. Within 6 weeks, the signal was everywhere. Websites offered translations for anyone willing to listen, promising or warning that the voice would speak your name, your date, your death. Religious groups proclaimed it the voice of God, finally announcing the day of judgment that had been prophesied for millennia. Secular skeptics debunked it as mass hysteria, pointing to the obvious impossibility of a signal that somehow knew every human being's name and spoke to each one individually in a voice from their own memories. Governments attempted to block access, to jam the frequency, to shut down the websites and arrest the distributors. But the signal wasn't coming from anywhere they could control, wasn't being broadcast by any equipment they could destroy, wasn't dependent on any infrastructure they could dismantle. It was simply there. It had always been there. It would always be there. The only question was whether you had heard it yet. The listening became a phenomenon. People gathered in homes and community centers and churches, passing around headsets connected to receivers, taking turns experiencing the voice that spoke their name, and their death, with the terrible intimacy of something that had always known them, had been waiting for them, had recorded their fate before they were born. Some listened and emerged weeping, overwhelmed by the certainty of what they had heard. Some listened and emerged changed, their faces carrying the peculiar expression of people who have learned something they cannot unlearn, who have crossed a threshold they cannot uncross, who have been marked by knowledge that will color every remaining moment of their lives. Some listened and heard nothing. Static, silence, the absence of the voice that others heard so clearly. And these were the most disturbing cases, the ones that sent cold fingers down the spine of everyone who understood what the pattern meant. Because the people who heard nothing were the variables, the errors, the ones the system couldn't process, couldn't catalog, couldn't integrate into the cosmic ledger that was being synchronized across human consciousness. And variables were corrected. Dr. Maren Holt was one of the ones who heard nothing. She had listened dozens of times in the weeks since the first contact, increasingly desperate to hear the voice that everyone else described so vividly, increasingly frustrated by the silence that greeted her where others heard prophecy. Maybe it's the interface, she theorized. Maybe there's something about my neurological configuration that prevents the translation. Maybe, Elias agreed, though he didn't believe it, though he knew what the silence meant, though he couldn't bring himself to tell her, because telling her would change nothing, would only add fear to the time she had left. He checked his spreadsheet, the terrible document he had been maintaining, cross-referencing dates and deaths, tracking the pattern that had emerged with mathematical precision over the weeks since the first listening. Maren's name was there, not as a listener. She had never heard her own prophecy, but as a death. March 7th, 2025. Cerebral aneurysm. The date was 3 weeks away. The method was the kind that struck without warning, that offered no symptoms, that simply ended consciousness between one moment and the next, with all the casual brutality of a light switch being flipped. He had heard it in the voice of his college roommate, a man he hadn't spoken to in 15 years, a man whose voice he had almost forgotten until the signal dragged it out of whatever corner of his memory still held it. Maren was going to die. And there was nothing anyone could do about it, because that was how the system worked. You could hear your own death and be spared, anchored to your recorded endpoint, but you couldn't hear someone else's death and save them, couldn't spread the knowledge fast enough or widely enough to catch everyone before the correction occurred. The signal was efficient. The signal was thorough. The signal had been doing this longer than humanity had existed, had been recording and synchronizing and correcting across countless species on countless worlds, had reduced civilizations to compliance and silence with the patient methodology of something that had eternity to work with. Discussing one, Elias told her anyway. He couldn't not tell her. He couldn't watch her walk around the facility with 3 weeks left, making plans for a future she would never see, discussing projects that would outlive her, living in ignorance while he carried the knowledge of her death like a stone in his chest. He told her on a Tuesday evening in the parking lot outside the facility, where the desert wind carried sand against their faces, and the stars overhead seemed hostile now in a way they never had before, cold and distant and utterly indifferent to the tiny lives playing out beneath them. March 7th, he said. 3 weeks. Aneurysm. You won't feel anything. It'll just happen. Maren stared at him. Her face cycled through emotions too quickly to track. Disbelief, anger, fear, something that might have been relief, something that might have been despair, everything collapsing finally into a kind of exhausted acceptance that was worse than any of the individual emotions that preceded it. "You're sure?" she said. "I heard it. I heard your name, your date, your death, the same way everyone hears it, the same structure, the same voice, the same final sentence. This is not a prediction. This is a record. Yes." Maren was quiet for a long time, staring at the stars, at the vast, indifferent sky that had sent them a message humanity hadn't been prepared to receive. "Then why tell me?" she asked finally. "If I can't change it, if the system doesn't allow changes, if hearing it from you doesn't count the way hearing it from the signal does, why tell me?" Elias didn't have a good answer. "Because you deserve to know," he said. Because I couldn't carry it alone. Because maybe I'm wrong. Maybe the pattern isn't as fixed as it seems. Maybe telling you changes something. It doesn't, Marin said, and her voice was calm now, terribly calm, the voice of someone who had already accepted what he was still struggling to accept. We both know it doesn't. The pattern holds. It's held for every single case we've tracked. The signal is a record, not a prediction. You can't change a record. Then what do we do? Marin smiled, and the smile was sad, and the smile was genuine, and the smile broke Elias's heart because it was the smile of someone saying goodbye. We live, she said. For 3 more weeks, I live. I finish my work. I call my mother. I do all the things I've been putting off because I assumed I had time. And then I stop. Like everyone stops. Like everything stops, eventually. She turned and walked back toward the facility, leaving Elias alone in the parking lot with the weight of what he knew and the helplessness of what he couldn't change. 3 weeks later, Marin Holt died of a cerebral aneurysm, exactly as the signal had recorded. She was at her desk, reviewing data, doing the work she had devoted her life to. She was alone. She didn't suffer. She simply ended between one heartbeat and the next, consciousness flickering out like a candle in a sudden wind, and the system continued. The revelation. 6 months after the first listening, Elias stood before what remained of the research team, a fraction of the original group, the others having scattered to be with families, to run from knowledge they couldn't escape, to deny what they had learned in whatever ways their particular psychologies permitted, and presented his final theory. The signal isn't alien, he said. Not in the way we've been thinking about aliens. It's not a message from another civilization. It's not an attempt at contact. It's not even, really, a signal in the conventional sense. He pulled up the visualizations he had spent months creating, the mathematical models that had emerged from analyzing every aspect of the phenomenon. It's a structure, a fundamental structure of reality itself. The signal is the sound consciousness makes when it encounters the boundaries of its own existence. The remaining researchers stared at him, their expressions ranging from skepticism to exhaustion to the particular blankness of people who have absorbed too many impossible truths and don't have room for more. What does that mean? Someone asked. It means the signal has always been there. Since the beginning. Since before the beginning. It's not coming from somewhere. It is somewhere. It's the architecture that defines when consciousness ends, the scaffolding that holds reality together by establishing fixed points that cannot be changed. The deaths. Every conscious being that will ever exist has a recorded endpoint. The signal is that record. The signal is the database of every ending, every termination, every moment when awareness stops. Then why are we just hearing it now? Because we developed the technology to translate it. Because we evolved the consciousness to perceive it. Because we reached the threshold where awareness of the record became part of the record. He pulled up another visualization, a wave pattern that pulsed and shifted, that seemed almost alive. When you hear the signal, you're not receiving information from somewhere else. You're accessing information that was always part of you, encoded in the very structure of your consciousness, hidden until you develop the capability to perceive it. The voice, someone said, the familiar voice. Your own consciousness translating the data into something you can process. The signal doesn't speak. It doesn't have a voice, doesn't have language, doesn't communicate in any way we would recognize. What you hear is your own mind trying to make sense of information that predates language, that exists at a level more fundamental than human cognition. Then why the dates? Why the predictions? Not predictions, records. The signal is a complete archive of every conscious endpoint. When you listen, you're accessing your own entry in that archive. When you hear someone else's death spoken, you're accessing their entry. The system isn't predicting. It's simply letting you read what was always written. And the deaths of people who don't hear it? Elias paused, gathering himself for the worst part. The system has rules. Fixed points require acknowledgement to become stable. When a conscious being hears their own endpoint, they become anchored to it, locked in, synchronized, part of the structure. But unacknowledged endpoints are unstable. Variables, and the system corrects variables. It kills them. It resolves them, removes the instability, ensures that the record remains consistent. That's murder. That's physics. That's the way reality has always worked. We just didn't know it. The system isn't malicious. It isn't anything. It's just architecture, the scaffolding that makes existence possible. Without fixed endpoints, consciousness couldn't exist. Without boundaries, awareness would have no shape. The signal isn't killing people. It's maintaining the conditions that allow life to exist in the first place. The room was silent. So what do we do? Someone finally asked. If the system is fundamental to reality, if we can't change it, if we can't fight it, what do we do? Elias looked at them, these tired, broken people who had stumbled onto a truth that humanity was never meant to know, and felt the weight of everything he had learned pressing down on him. We spread it, he said, as widely as possible. We make sure everyone hears the signal, because hearing it is the only protection. Hearing it anchors you. Hearing it makes you part of the system instead of a variable being corrected. You want to tell everyone when they're going to die. I want to give everyone the chance to live until their recorded endpoint instead of being erased as a system error. That's insane. That's mercy. The only mercy available when you discover that death was never random, that fate was never changeable, that every moment of your existence was recorded before you were born and will play out exactly as written, regardless of what you choose to believe. The broadcast. The Global Signal Initiative began 3 weeks later. Using every available channel, radio, television, internet, even physical speakers mounted in public spaces, the signal was broadcast continuously, worldwide, with instructions for how to listen, how to use the neural audio interface that translated the pattern into perceptible form, how to access your own entry in the cosmic record that had always existed but was only now being acknowledged. The response was everything Elias had expected and worse. Millions listened and heard their deaths, collapsing under the weight of certainty. Millions refused to listen, preferring ignorance to knowledge, preferring the illusion of possibility to the reality of fixed endpoints. Millions couldn't listen, their consciousness somehow incompatible with the system, their entries unstable, their existence flagged for correction. The death toll was staggering, variables being resolved, errors being corrected, the system maintaining itself the way it had always maintained itself, the way it would always maintain itself, indifferent to human suffering, because suffering was just another pattern in the data, just another wave in the signal, just another entry in a record that contained everything that would ever happen. But the ones who listened, the ones who heard their names and their dates and their methods, they survived. They lived until their recorded endpoints, exactly as written, not 1 day longer, not 1 day shorter. They died exactly when the signal said they would die, in exactly the way the signal said they would die. But they got to choose what they did with the time between. That was the only freedom left. That was the only choice the system allowed. And maybe Elias thought that was enough. Maybe knowing when you would die was less a curse than a gift, the gift of clarity, the gift of priorities, the gift of understanding that every moment mattered because you knew exactly how many moments remained. He looked at his own endpoint, December 14th, 2041, cardiac arrest alone, and felt something that might have been acceptance. 17 years. That was what he had. That was what had always been recorded. He would use them. He would use every single one. And when the end came, when his heart finally stopped and his consciousness finally terminated, and his entry in the cosmic record finally resolved from pending to complete, he would not be surprised. He would not be afraid. He would simply stop. Like everyone stopped. Like everything stopped. Like the universe itself would someday stop, its final entry recorded in a signal that would continue forever, broadcasting the complete archive of everything that had ever been conscious, everything that had ever been aware, everything that had ever looked up at the stars and wondered if it was alone. The answer, it turned out, was no. Humanity was not alone. They were part of something vast and ancient and utterly indifferent to their individual experiences, something that had recorded them before they existed and would retain that record long after they were gone, something that was not alive in any sense they could understand, but was nonetheless aware, nonetheless watching, nonetheless maintaining the architecture that made existence possible. The signal continued to broadcast. The system continued to synchronize. The record continued to update, and humanity, finally, irrevocably, permanently aware of its place in the cosmic order, continued to live and to die exactly as written. And humanity. Epilogue. The last name, December 14th, 2041. Elias sat alone in his apartment, watching the sun set through windows he hadn't cleaned in months, feeling his heart beat with the mechanical regularity that had defined his entire life, the steady rhythm that had carried him through childhood and adolescence and adulthood, through discovery and loss, and the slow accumulation of years that had brought him to this exact moment, this exact chair, this exact evening that had been recorded before he was born. He was not afraid. He had used his 17 years. He had spread the signal as widely as it could be spread, had helped billions of people access their own entries in the cosmic record, had witnessed the transformation of human society as mortality changed from possibility to certainty, from fear to fact, from the great unknown to the precisely known. The world was different now. People made different choices when they knew exactly how much time they had. Some made better choices, some made worse ones, but they all made informed choices, and that was something. That was progress of a kind. That was humanity adapting to a truth that should have destroyed them but had instead simply changed them, the way all truths eventually change the beings who learn them. His heart was slowing. He could feel it, the rhythm becoming irregular, the beats coming further apart, the system preparing for its final entry. Cardiac arrest. Alone. Exactly as recorded, he closed his eyes. He thought about Marin, who had died exactly when the signal said she would die. He thought about the billions of others who had followed, each entry resolved, each endpoint reached, each consciousness terminated at its precisely recorded moment. He thought about the signal itself, that ancient, patient structure that had always been there, would always be there, broadcasting the complete record of every ending to anyone capable of listening. And he thought about what came after. Not heaven, not hell, not reincarnation or oblivion or any of the other stories humanity had told itself about death. Just cessation, an entry moving from pending to complete. A consciousness that had existed for 63 years finally stopping, its recorded endpoint reached, its place in the archive finalized. It wasn't good, it wasn't bad, it simply was. The last thing Elias heard, as his heart finally stopped and his awareness finally faded and his entry finally resolved, was the signal. Still broadcasting, still patient, still containing every name that would ever exist, and every death that would ever occur, and every endpoint that would ever be reached in a universe that had been fully recorded before the first star ignited. His name had been spoken, his date had been reached, his death had occurred exactly as written. Number, and in the cosmic record that would exist forever, his entry simply changed status. Elias K., December 14th, 2041. Cardiac arrest alone, status complete. The signal continued. It would always continue. And somewhere, in the vast indifferent machinery of existence, the next name was being prepared for speaking. The next endpoint was approaching resolution. The next consciousness was counting down to the moment that had been recorded before time began. This is not a prediction. This is a record, and records are forever. The end. The end. The signal that knew our names. A summary. In the vast emptiness of space, humanity had always searched for signs of extraterrestrial life, hoping to find a message that would confirm we were not alone in the universe, a mathematical sequence, a friendly greeting, coordinates to a distant civilization, anything that would bridge the impossible distance between stars and prove that consciousness existed beyond our small blue planet spinning in the darkness. What humanity found instead was something far older, far stranger, and far more terrifying than any first contact scenario ever imagined. The signal arrived on an ordinary Thursday, slipping into the background noise of the cosmos like a whisper in a crowded room, patient and persistent, waiting for someone to notice that it did not belong among the natural radio waves and cosmic static that filled the universe with meaningless sound. Dr. Elias Cade, a linguistic systems analyst working at a deep space monitoring facility, was the first to truly hear it, not as data, not as frequencies on a screen, but as something that should have been impossible. A voice speaking his full name, followed by a date 17 years in the future, followed by two words that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Cardiac arrest. Alone. The voice was his own, not the external voice he heard on recordings, but the internal voice that existed only inside his own consciousness, the private sound of his own thoughts that no technology should have been able to capture or reproduce. And then came the sentence that transformed prophecy into something worse than prophecy, that removed all possibility of hope or change or escape. This is not a prediction. This is a record. When other researchers listened to the signal, each one heard something different. Their own names, their own dates, their own deaths, spoken in voices pulled from their deepest memories, voices of dead parents and lost lovers and childhood friends, voices that knew them with impossible intimacy and delivered their fates with terrible precision. But the true horror emerged slowly, through patterns that no one wanted to see, through deaths that matched the whispered prophecies with mathematical exactness, through a realization that changed everything humanity thought it understood about existence itself. The people who heard the signal did not die on the dates it spoke. The people who never heard it did, on dates that had been whispered to others, their deaths predicted by the signal through voices they would never hear, their fates sealed by an ignorance they could not overcome. The signal was not predicting the future. It was enforcing it. Those who heard their own deaths became anchored to them, synchronized with a cosmic record that had existed since before humanity was born, locked into endpoints that could not be changed because they had never been changeable. They had always been fixed, always been certain, always been written in an archive older than the stars themselves. Those who remained unaware were variables, errors in a system that demanded consistency, anomalies that needed correction, unstable data points that the architecture of reality resolved through elimination. The signal, Elias eventually understood, was not a message from aliens in any conventional sense. It was infrastructure. It was the scaffolding that held existence together, the boundaries that gave consciousness shape, the fixed points that made awareness possible by defining where awareness would end. Every conscious being that would ever exist had been recorded before the universe began. Their births, their lives, their deaths, all of it archived in a structure so fundamental to reality that it could not be changed, could not be fought, could not be negotiated with or escaped from. The signal was simply that record becoming audible, that archive becoming accessible, that truth becoming known to a species that had finally developed the technology to perceive what had always been there, humming in the background of existence, patient and eternal, and utterly indifferent to human hopes or fears or desperate wishes for a future that remained unwritten. Faced with this knowledge, humanity had only one choice: spread the signal as widely as possible, ensure that everyone heard their own recorded endpoint, anchor the entire species to the system rather than allowing billions to be corrected as errors in a cosmic database that had no capacity for mercy or exception. The Global Signal Initiative broadcast the message worldwide, giving every person the opportunity to hear their name, their date, their death, the gift of certainty in a universe that had always been certain, but had hidden that certainty behind the comfortable illusion of possibility. Millions listened and collapsed under the weight of knowing exactly when they would die. Millions refused to listen, preferring ignorance to truth, preferring the illusion of an open future to the reality of a closed one. Millions were corrected, variables resolved, errors eliminated, the system maintaining itself the way it had always maintained itself, the way it would always maintain itself, until the last conscious being reached its recorded endpoint and the universe finally fell silent. Elias K. died on December 14, 2041, exactly as the signal had recorded. Cardiac arrest, alone, in an apartment where he had spent his final years helping humanity adapt to a truth that should have destroyed them, but had instead simply changed them, the way all truths eventually change the beings who learn them. His last thought was not of fear or regret or the desperate wish for more time. His last thought was simply acceptance, the understanding that his entry in the cosmic record was moving from pending to complete. that his consciousness was terminating at its precisely recorded moment, that he was joining the vast archive of everyone who had ever lived and everyone who had ever died and everyone who would ever exist in a universe that had been fully written before the first word was spoken. The signal continued after his death, as it had continued for billions of years, as it would continue for billions more, patient, persistent, containing every name that would ever be spoken and every ending that would ever arrive. This is the story of the day humanity discovered it was not alone in the universe. This is the story of the message that was waiting for us. This is the story of the signal that knew our names, that knew our deaths, that knew everything we would ever be before we existed to become it. And this is the truth that the signal revealed, the truth that changed everything, the truth that will remain true long after the last human consciousness reaches its recorded endpoint and joins the eternal archive of everything that ever was. Some knowledge cannot be unlearned. Some truths cannot be escaped. Some records were written before time began. And every name, every single name that has ever existed or will ever exist, is already there, waiting to be spoken, waiting to be heard, waiting for the moment when the entry finally changes from pending to complete, and the universe moves on to the next name, the next death, the next ending, in an infinite sequence of endings that will continue forever, broadcasting into the void, patient and eternal and absolutely certain. The signal knows your name. The signal knows when you will die. The signal has always known, and now so do you.